Hey guys! So today I wanted to talk to you about American kettlebell swings. As a CrossFit coach, I tend to see a lot of the same mistakes made over and over with this movement. It seems pretty simple, right? You're just doing a swing, but there's actually a lot that goes into it, and I want to make sure that we're doing it correctly to not only protect our back and joints and so on and so forth, but make sure that we're getting the proper amount of power out of the movement and we're doing it efficiently. So today we're going to go through the top 5 mistakes that I tend to see a lot with kettlebell swings and learn how to correct them. Alright guys, so one of the most common mistakes I see before we even get this thing off the floor is the pull from the floor. So usually people think that they either want to start with the kettlebell between their feet or behind their feet in order to get the most out of that first swing and avoid the warm-up swings to build that momentum. But believe it or not, there actually is a correct and more efficient way to get this thing off the floor in one pull and allow you the power to go right overhead. All right, so the setup I'm looking for actually involves having this kettlebell about a foot, maybe even a foot and a half in front of my feet. So I'm gonna get into my squat, sort of my squat position. I'm gonna get this guy about a foot in front, and then I'm going to drop my hips and flatten my back and bring my shoulder blades down and back. So you'll notice that I'm not here, I'm here. I'm very engaged through my lats, and I really have the shoulder blades screwed back as much as I can. And all I'm gonna do is actually kind of hike this back between my legs and then stand up really fast. So the second most common mistake I see is doing more of a squat than a hinge. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with what a good morning looks like, but you either have a barbell or some kind of weight here and you're just hinging back. I want you to think more good morning than air squat. So it's more of a hinge back than a squat down, and this will allow us to create the maximum power output to let that let that kettlebell go straight up overhead. So what we don't want is to be going straight down and straight up. We want to kind of be hinging back and then using that forward momentum to create the swing. So let's talk about how to do that. So I'll actually usually have my athletes start without any kettlebell at all, just practicing going back into a hinge here and then extending straight up. Back into a hinge. You don't want your knees locked here, but you don't really want them in a squat, right? So you're just sending that butt back. You feel a nice stretch in your hamstrings here. Your back is staying flat and your shoulder blades are staying retracted, and then you're just going to stand as quickly as you can. So practice this just a few times. All right, so now that we've talked about pulling the kettlebell from the floor and a squat versus hinge, I want to talk about one of the biggest mistakes I see in the kettlebell going up. I feel like it's very common for websites and blogs and some coaches to be telling you to use your hips to generate that upward force on the kettlebell. And while that is sort of true, I think that can get kind of misleading, and you can tell it's misleading because what you can see in people is they kind of create this one-person wave, right? Where it starts looking like this. Right? Where they're trying so much to get their hips forward that their torso goes back, and then they have to get this thing overhead and it looks like this, and they kind of create this thing. It's pretty easy to tell that that's not really a stable position for your back or your body to be in, right? Doing like a snake move like that. So here's what I want you to do. Instead of thinking about throwing your hips forward, I just want you to think about coming to the standing position as fast as you can. So it looks like this. From back, instead of hips forward, I just want you to go to standing, just like this. Back, stand, back, stand. So I'm creating a lot of force into the floor, and when I'm doing these drills, not usually when I have weight in my hands, but you'll even see my feet leave the floor because there's so much power in me just squeezing my glutes and pushing my hips into the standing position and snapping to standing as fast as possible. I'm not trying to drive my hips forward or drive my hips to the ceiling. I'm just trying to snap into the standing position with as much abruptness, as much power as possible. And that is the secret to an efficient kettlebell swing. All right, so the third most common mistake I see actually involves the bell going down. So now we've got it up safely, we learn how to extend our hips, all that good stuff. Now the bell has to come down. So one of the things I see a lot of is where the hips are starting to hinge while the bell is still coming down. I want you to try instead to be as patient as possible and stand with your glutes engaged and actively squeezed as long as you can, and almost until you have actual contact with your forearms on your hips. So in that standing position, we're not going to break the hips until the very last moment. Okay, so sometimes even if we've gotten through the start, the hip position, the swing, and the return all down right, one last common mistake I see is when we have that thing fully extended overhead, right in the top position. And even if people have a lot of power in their swing, they're hitting the right positions in their hips, they'll still find that when they're overhead, they all of a sudden break and their low back is hyperextended and their ribs are sticking out, right? So it looks like this. Again, not a stable position. I want you to instead focus on keeping those ribs tucked down. Think about bringing the bottom of your rib cage to the top of your hip bone. How to think about that for a second. Kind of in this like crunch while I'm standing here. So everything is stacked. I'm not extended. So even while I'm overhead, my ribs are down. Sometimes mobility prevents us from getting all the way overhead and not opening up. So if you find that you can't quite hit that position overhead and keep your ribs tucked, I would maybe advise staying in a little bit of a lower swing instead of going all the way overhead and compromising your spine. So I want you to just focus on that. You can film yourself, you can watch yourself in a mirror and see if you're staying in a stacked position through that whole swing or if you're breaking once you start to get overhead.